Good day, everyone. My name is Gaylor Montmasson-Clair. I'm a senior economist at TIPS, that's Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, where I lead our work around sustainability and just transition. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of TIPS and WWF South Africa to this webinar on the just transition in South Africa liquid fuel value chain. As you most probably know, the topic of a just transition is quite central to most policy discussions at the moment in the country and actually globally. At the moment, though, most discussions are quite focused on the coal value chain, certainly in South Africa, for a lot of obvious reasons. Yet the transition will have economy and society-wide implications. And the liquid fuel value chain is no exception. It's really set to be impacted as the world shifts to a low carbon economy and a climate resilience economy. Transportation is getting increasingly electrified or powered by new energy sources. And effectively, the consumption of traditional petroleum products is set to be negatively impacted in the future. South Africa, of course, is not a traditional oil producer, but the liquid fuel value chain in the country is actually quite important. It ranges from coal and gas to liquid production, to import terminals, to pipelines and refineries, transportation services, and of course, retail through the petrol stations. This is all in the balance, and we've seen it both from, I guess, a sustainability perspective, from an economic perspective, but also, of course, with the recent event in KwaZulu-Natal, some of the facilities, of course, are having issues around climate resilience. The flip side, by contrast, is that the domestic industry could become a major player in the production of so-called power fuels or green fuels, leveraging our strong potential for renewable energy, biomass production, green hydrogen, and of course the Fischer-Tropsch process that we have mastered in the country. So certainly very much a multifaceted agenda for today's discussion, and we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists to get into that today. Before we do so, a couple of housekeeping issues. You'll note that this meeting is hosted as this webinar is hosted as a meeting, actually, and not just in a webinar format. So feel free to interact in the chat with the group as well as with each other. Of course, we do ask that you remain muted if you're not speaking. You can also raise your hand, and we'll take some live questions. The PowerPoints, as well as the recording and the papers linked to the PowerPoint will be shared following this event. So I think we set for a really great 2 hours ahead of us. We'll start with 3 inputs of about 15 minutes each. One focusing more on refineries and the logistics sector of the liquid fuel value chain. Then we'll move to petrol stations, effectively, and the retail side of the industry. Before then looking at the other side of the coin, maybe the opportunity around sustainable aviation fuel, for instance, and the use of biomass. Upon those 3 key inputs, about 15 minutes each, as I said, we'll take questions of clarity if there are any, and then we'll move into a panel discussion where we've got some great panelists to start unpacking those issues a bit further, along with you, of course, in a very dynamic engagement as much as possible. Without further ado, let's jump right in, and then we'll take our first input for today, which will be, as I said, on the refining and logistics sector of South Africa's liquid fuel industry. It will be by Dave Wright. Dave Wright is an independent researcher, but he's also the director of the South African National Energy Association. Dave has spent a considerable amount of time in the liquid fuel industry, working at Engine for a great number of years, and has now moved into more of a research space, also being an adjunct professor at UCT. So he comes with a great deal of knowledge on the industry, kind of an inside track, of course, but now as well an outside eye. So very pleased to have you with us, Dave. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Gaylor. Appreciate it, and thanks for inviting me to present today. Thank you very much for the introduction, Gaylor, and thank you very much to everyone for attending. It's a great pleasure on my part to be here and to share this information and this research. Thank you to TIPS and to WWF for sponsoring it. Now we need to get it to work. Oh, there we go. So before getting into it, I'd just like to acknowledge that Gaylor, Mohammed from TIPS have been very helpful. So is Louise Goltz, Farai from WWF, and Chasha Bole Rental, who has now moved to Intertrag, all been very helpful in their input on this work. The context, the presentation I'm going to give is essentially starting with some context. Then I would like to share a value chain schematic, then go to the job numbers and talk about some direct job categories, look at some skill level comparisons of the liquid fuels industry versus that for the average of South Africa. And then I'd like to talk about the transition timing and end with a conclusion. So the context really is, this is a very high level study, and I'm focusing on refining and logistics only. And I'll explain what I mean by refining and logistics when I get to the schematic. The consequence of this is that detailed job data is not readily available in the public domain from the oil industry or liquid fuels industry. It's rather opaque, as I'm sure many of you understand and know. However, we were fortunate in that Sapir commissioned FTI Consulting to produce a report, which ended up, that was published in September 2021, and they published job numbers for the industry there. And those are the numbers that I will focus on in this presentation. The other aspect that I think is important to understand from a context point of view is the status of the various refinery operations in the country. As it's probably well known already that the Astron refinery in Cape Town has been offline since July 2020. And they are now, I understand, due to start up in the third quarter of this year. NGN has been shut down since December 2020 as well. And they announced during the course of 2021 that they do not plan to restart the refinery and they will shut it down for good. NatRef is still operational, although I understand that the Sasol CFO has said that investment in the upgrade necessary to produce clean fuel to quality fuel is not viable, and that the future of NatRef's of operation will be announced at the end of the third quarter in 2022. Petrol SA is shut down because of no feed, and Shell and BP announced at the beginning of this year that the SAPREF refinery in Durban would cease operations in March of this year, and I believe it has. So with that as context, then let's move on. This is the value chain schematic that I'm going to be talking to, and essentially you can see the crude would come into refineries that work for them to produce fuel, which would then go through into primary distribution, into the terminals and depots, secondary distribution, then into the marketing sector. Primary distribution is obviously done by pipeline, road, rail, and coastal shipping, predominantly pipeline, but road is increasing, and there's very little rail. Coastal shipping moves product between the ports if it's required. What I'm going to talk about in terms of refining and logistics, refining will obviously be about the refineries, but logistics, I'm going to include the importation of both crude and product, as well as primary distribution, the terminal and depots, and the secondary distribution. And in order to link it in with the terminology that was used in the FDR report, you'll see that where I've called something a logistics sector, they've talked about feedstocks and imports, which is really this side. They talk about refining and manufacturing as the refining sector, and then they talk about distribution and storage in the other portion of the logistics sector. So this then is the data that comes from the FDR consulting report, and it's this data here that sits in this column. That's the data that is given. It's direct and indirect jobs in 2019. And you'll see that from here, there's about 130,000 jobs in the marketing sector. And if you look at the next biggest, it's in refining at about 64,000 direct and indirect jobs, leaving about 30-odd thousand in the what I've called logistics, which is feedstock and crude import section, as well as distribution and storage. Now, in order to get a feel for the direct jobs in the industry, because that data is not readily available, other than this big number here at the bottom, the 10,000 number, I use this distribution, which is derived from the distribution of the total direct and indirect jobs, to estimate the direct jobs, which are essentially the jobs that are in the SAPEA, that are SAPEA member jobs. Now, what I should make very clear is that this does not include Sasol Secunda jobs. Sasol Secunda jobs would swamp this number completely. So this is really just for members of SAPEA. So if we look at the numbers which I'm talking about, as I said, it's 64,000 in the refining sector, which are the direct and indirect jobs, and 30,000 in the logistics side, giving us about a total of 95,000, which constitutes about 38% of the total number of jobs. The sizable number is obviously in the refining side of things. Looking at categories, and this is direct job categories, so it's looking at the jobs in the liquid fuels companies themselves. Obviously, there are management jobs, professional jobs, process operators, maintenance artisans, and maintenance artisans is a very big covers a big section of people, in the sense that it's the fitters, the riggers, the electricians, and a wide range of people there. Then obviously truck drivers on the distribution side in particular, and then obviously the clerical people. If we look at the different categories, the management and professional categories, I think, I've called head office jobs, and they should be able to find jobs in alternative organizations. Process operators are, I think, in a sense, the most difficult people to place because of their specifically focused skill. So we would either need to find new operator jobs for them, which is where the issue of the bioprocessing comes in, or we have to cross-skill them. As far as the maintenance artisans, truck drivers, and clerical categories are concerned, they also ought to be able to find jobs in other industries. The snag, of course, is that in order to absorb those people, the industry needs to grow. And we know that we're not seeing much growth in our industry sector at the moment. This slide is not really meaningful other than to show that the oil industry labor force is has more skills associated with it than the average skill level in South African labor force. So just to note that we're dealing with a reasonably high level of skilled people in the industry. So looking at transition timing, the point is that for the refining sector, it's already started. And in this case, the transition is not driven by the need to reduce carbon. It's driven by economics. Essentially, refineries are closing down because they're not going to be upgraded to produce clean fuels to quality fuel. Petrol, SA, of course, is a different case. They just don't have any feedstock at the moment. So the point then is that with it already started, we need to look at what action can be applied to that sector. As far as the logistics sector is concerned, it's a much different timescale for the transition, because for as long as liquid fuels are required in the South African industry, there will be a need for the logistics sector to operate efficiently, primarily off imported finished product. And obviously, what will drive the transition is the reduced demand for fossil fuels going forward. And if we look at the sort of timing that people are talking about, it's suggested that 2035 is probably when the fossil fuel demand is likely to start to fall off. The benefit that this provides, of course, is that it gives us time to plan how to manage the transition. So moving to the conclusion, the refining sector, we need to already be finding new jobs. And sorry, I should just have said right at the outset that those numbers, being 2019 numbers, were obviously prior to any announced closures on the refining side. So there would have been, in 2019, there would have been 64,000 direct and indirect jobs at risk, with about let's say 3,000 direct jobs. I believe the process operators will be, process operators are probably the most highly skilled group out of the group that I'm talking to on this slide, but they'll be the most likely to replace in a like-for-like position, unless, of course, we can get the biomass processing initiative off the ground. I've said that the other three sectors, the other three categories would be able to find jobs in other parts of our industry, but there's the catch that the industry needs to grow. Possible new operations, we've mentioned the bioprocessing side of things, or biorefineries. There could be an opportunity in carbon dioxide conversion and the production of green hydrogen. But unfortunately, there's a mismatch in the timing, in the sense that none of these new operations have really got off the ground, and people are already being put on notice in the refining sector in terms of their jobs. Just a quick slide using some data from the WWF Fuel for Future report, and it's a busy slide, so I just want you to concentrate on these two columns. And the important takeaway here is you will see that there are a number of facilities, processing facilities, which could come into operation depending on which pathway is chosen, or if all the pathways are implemented. They will be smaller operations employing less people, but because there are more numbers, they may well be able to absorb my concern, the process operators, which are my concern. As far as the logistics sector, as I said earlier, there's no immediate pressure on the transition aspect. The number of jobs will reduce as the demand of petrol and diesel reduces. And it looks as though we've got time. to do something because of the demand reductions not expected between 2035 or before 2035. So summing up, as far as the refinery is concerned, we need to do something now. As far as the logistics group are concerned, we have time to plan for the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dave, for this really fantastic input. To the point, very clear. I think it really puts the picture forward around the challenges that are actually already there. The transition, certainly when it comes to refineries, is arguably too late to plan. It's already materialized, and I think in a way, we missed the boat on this one. Logistics, there is some time. And I think it's also important to understand, of course, refineries themselves directly maybe do not employ large amount of people directly, but do have an indirect impact, and also in the communities that they play a big role. And I think we certainly saw that a few weeks ago at one of the engagements held by the Presidential Climate Commission in South Durban. Specifically around the engine side, effectively. So we moved from a transition that's already happening, that's the refineries, to one that we have to plan for, which is kind of the logistics. And now we'll look at one that we may have a little bit of time as well, but it employs a sizable amount of people. And that's petrol stations that we have all over the country, everywhere, and do have a significant impact on our employment and economic landscape. To talk about those issues, we welcome TIPS colleague, senior economist Nokwanda Maseko. Nokwanda is a senior economist at TIPS, as I said, and she's been in the field for quite some time. She previously worked at National Treasury as well as the Economic Development Department, and she was part of the team that worked on the vulnerability assessment and resilience plans from a climate perspective, particularly looking at the petroleum-based road transport industry, and of course petrol station specifically. And the work that she's going to present expands on that. So we're very pleased to have you, Nokwanda. Over to you.
Thanks, Gaylor. Good afternoon, colleagues. Let me just share my screen. So as Gaylor already said, my name is Nokwanda Maseko. I am a senior economist at TIPS, and my presentation is titled Petrol Stations, Workers and the Just Transition in South Africa. And the presentation itself comes from an upcoming policy brief of the same title that will be published in the coming weeks. Just as a matter of context, I think it's important to note what Dave said in terms of data availability. And so in some instances, I used the same data that Dave used, especially for employment, as well as GDP contribution. And this comes from SAPIA member reports. But to note from those reports is that not all of them necessarily report, especially on their financials. Excuse me. And so the GDP data that is presented might actually be lower than what the actual GDP is, because, as I said, not all members of SAPIA do the reporting on an annual basis. But moving on from there, and as a matter of background, before I get into the actual presentation, as Dave already mentioned, there are some issues with refineries in South Africa, and that also coincides with not the shift so much as much as the discussion to move to cleaner fuel standards, so to Euro 5, for example. But because of the recent issues with refineries and just the issue of how much it would cost to make that investment, I don't necessarily think that we will see that happen. And so I don't delve into it that much in the paper, and I don't really look at it in this presentation. But that said, as already Gaylor mentioned, petrol stations are important for the economy. They provide fuel for about 12 million cars in the country and employ upwards of 130,000 people based on the labor markets dynamic survey for 2019. And so the bulk of the revenue from petrol stations comes from the supply of liquid fuels for vehicles, which is about 60 to 80% of the revenue, depending on the location of the petrol station. Generally, the petroleum value chain is integrated, and in liquid fuels, what we see is that in most instances, the owners of the refineries also own the wholesale and retail infrastructure. So the petrol stations in this case. So although the petrol stations are part of franchise, so it might be, the actual operation might be owned by just a regular person. The infrastructure itself still belongs to these major petroleum companies, such as Engen, for example, such as Shell. That said, I think just given how much they contribute to the economy, just in terms of the job, as well as the provision of liquid fuels, this gives them a lot of power in terms of ensuring security of supply of fuel, but also meeting emissions targets. And we know, unfortunately, this is based on really old data. I believe it's from about 2010, which is that the transport sector contributes about 11% to total emissions in the country, and about 91% of that is from road transport, which then directly links to liquid fuels. And so reducing transport sector emissions means shifting to cleaner fuels, and that could be in the form of biofuels or natural gas, as well as hybrid and fully electric vehicles. So what we see is that shifting to biofuels and natural gas, in the short term, it wouldn't necessarily mean that every petrol station worker is without a job. But that picture changes quite a lot when you start taking into account electric vehicles, assuming that every car in South Africa then becomes an electric vehicle. And that becomes a problem, because whereas you can charge your car at home, you need to go to the petrol station to get fuel, unless you are comfortable with buying like a 5 liter every other few hours, given the cost of petrol. But nevertheless, the effect of climate means that it is necessary to shift to electric vehicles, which is the long-term goal. And as of now, the timelines remain quite unclear. So in terms of the economics of petrol stations, as Dave mentioned, generally the entire value chain has not been immune to the impact of COVID-19, more so for petrol stations, which saw demand declined significantly within the first 35 days of the lockdown. And what we saw was that I believe by May, demand had already declined by about 60%. So even though this was an essential service, because everyone was at home, essentially, there was not enough demand to keep some of these petrol stations operational. And so we see that that about 31% of petrol stations were not operating at all during the first 35 days of the lockdown. And then some employers reported not being able to pay salaries. But in terms of the actual economic contribution, GDP as indicated earlier, so this is from SANEA data, and essentially what we see here is that the entire value chain contributed about 163 billion rand. So yeah, so the entire value chain contributed about 163 billion to GDP, and the retail side, which is petrol stations, accounted for about 15% of that, whereas refining and manufacturing made up about 39%, and then wholesale made up 32%. So you see that in this first graph here. And then in terms of employment, retail accounted for about 39.7% of total employment in the value chain, which contributes upwards of 300,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs. And again, this is based on 2019 data. And again, as I said earlier, this is just part of the data that's reported by SANEA members. So this is some of their financials just to see their economic contribution up to 2019. And I did adjust this for inflation up to 2019 rands. So it will look a bit more different than what SANEA initially reported. And what we see mostly is that the biggest contribution comes from duties and levies, whereas employment costs have remained somewhat stagnant since 2010. And so that would be the how much they pay in terms of salaries and benefits. Moving along to then trying to understand who petrol station workers are, because they are the ones who are vulnerable at the end of the day because of the transition away from internal combustion vehicles. What I've found from the data is that petrol station employment is largely dominated by Black men as well as Black women. So in 2019, Black men accounted for about 64% of total employment in petrol stations, and Black women accounted for just under 20%. I will note here that there's some slight problems with the employment data for 2020, but using it nevertheless just to see an indication of what happened as a result of the pandemic, we see that employment went down slightly, but we saw the share of Black men and Black women employed in that segment increase slightly. Employment, although distributed across the country, because obviously petrol stations are located in different places, about three provinces account for about 2/3 of total employment for petrol stations. And then in terms of petrol stations, education, we see that, and again, this goes back to some of the work we did as part of the vulnerability assessment, which was done, I believe, in 2019. But we see that petrol workers' education does not deviate that much from the national norm. So roughly half of workers have a metric, which is slightly higher than other formal employment, but those workers also then tend to lag behind in terms of post-secondary school education at about 8% compared to around 25% for other formal workers. And as noted, even in the vulnerability assessment, this is likely related to petrol station work being transitory, in that during the interviews we conducted, we found that some of the workers use that role as a stepping stone to other education, employment, or business opportunities. And so they don't tend to stay in that employment for for a very long time. These workers are generally not unionized, which is made hard because most petrol stations have fewer than 20 workers, and so unionizing is a bit hard. But they do tend to contribute to unemployment insurance fund, as well as some retirement funds, which then gives them some resources to be able to deal with the transition. And so in terms of a way forward for the actual transition itself, I think the most important thing I can say here is that at the end of the day, I think we cannot necessarily start planning for petrol station workers until we know exactly what is happening with the transition to electric vehicles. And so what I do in the paper and this presentation is just try to outline one or two decisions that need to be made in the short term that will then guide the planning going forward. And so in South Africa, what I come back to in an effort to try and figure out the timeline is essentially we need to ensure security of supply of clean energy, so electricity, for example, that is from renewable resources. And this is important because inconsistent electricity supply then makes it difficult to start talking about everyone using an electric vehicle. Secondly, is the decision around the cost of electric vehicles. Yes, the cost of batteries is going down, but generally electric vehicles are still far more expensive than ICE vehicles. So if you look at the average, I think the entry point for an electric vehicle is around 700,000, whereas the entry point for a second-hand car in South Africa would be around 300,000, which is a very big difference. And so what needs to be done is figure out what support can be offered to consumers in order to incentivize the uptake of electric vehicles. Other countries have looked at tax credits, for example, and then also looking at whether local manufacturing would significantly reduce the cost, and how then would it be best to support those manufacturers. And these decisions, I think once made, would give an indication of how much when exactly would we be able to ensure that we have steady electricity supply, but also that we have the ways to increase the use of electric vehicles so that it's not just one or two cars here and there. Because at the end of the day, I think what will impact petrol station workers is the shift away from ICE vehicles, obviously, and that's not going to happen unless the number of electric vehicles in the country increases significantly. And so we need to think about how to address these two issues in particular. And then from there, I think that would then give us some sort of timeline for the full shift to electric vehicles, and having that timeline then gives some guidance in terms of what support workers would need. So for example, if we're talking about 2050, which is when most countries, companies, and regional governments have committed to net zero emissions. Even companies such as Shell, for example, they've committed to 2050 for net zero emissions, which essentially means that we have slightly under 3 decades to address employment in petrol station. And because, again, as I said, these workers are transitory, one option would then be to phase out employment as we get closer to whatever the fixed timeline is for getting ICE vehicles out of South African roads. And that would mean we also then need to stop hiring for petrol stations. But there are other workers that cannot, that do not see that work as transitory. And so those workers would remain. And what do we do with them? But also what would we need to do for workers, and if the timeline is slightly shorter? So for example, as Dave mentioned, if we're looking at 2035, again, I think there would be a need to stop all new hiring in petrol stations, because it would essentially mean that we're creating unsustainable jobs and would therefore make it, I believe, difficult to try and move away from liquid fuels. But also existing workers can be given different kinds of support. So early retirement for those who are closer to retirement. And I provide the information in the policy brief to say this is essentially how many workers would be then closer to retirement. And then those that are not closer to retirement, they would be reskilled. I mean, obviously working in petrol station, they have some retail work already, but what other skills can they be reskilled for? What other jobs can petrol station workers be put into that requires exploration? And then there's also the expansion of social security. So then looking at the basic income grant, for example, which not only ensures an income for day-to-day living, I mean, also keeping in mind the fact that it would not be too much money, but I think it would give some sort of income for workers who've lost their jobs to then also be able to, just do basic things like applying for a job, which also requires one to have money. And then the last issue I looked at is what to do with the infrastructure. I mean, in the short term, this infrastructure, as I said, it would be useful for other fuels. We already have petrol stations in the country that have natural gas as well as other liquid fuels. Yes, it would be good in the short term because it would maintain jobs during the transition, but also, especially natural gas is not a long-term solution just because it's not as clean as solar energy would be, for example. And and so it would not be a long-term solution. Also, it does not reduce emissions to zero, which is another problem. But moreover, as was already mentioned, there were already concerns around moving to Euro 5 just because of the cost involved and for retrofitting that infrastructure. And so the question here would be, would it be viable to invest in natural gas and other biofuels for the long term, when the goal would likely be to move to electric vehicles once we phase out all ICE vehicles. And so long-term solutions must be found for what to do with that infrastructure. But I mean, obviously the best thing would be to keep those petrol stations as economic hubs. So we need to find solutions that make sure that infrastructure is used for other things. Obviously, it will be difficult to use all of them, but if we can get most of them or even half of them to operate as other businesses, for example, that would be a starting point. So yeah, that's about it in terms of what my presentation looks like, as well as what the policy brief itself looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Nokwanda, for this. I think it's it puts certainly the issue into perspective. 130,000 people directly employed in petrol stations. It's more than what we have directly employed in coal mining or even in automotive manufacturing in this country. So I think it's a sizable amount of jobs, and of course there is some time to see the transition coming. But I guess we should use it as an opportunity to plan rather than as a way to say, well, we've got time for it. So I think that's really great, and let's unpack that further just now. I think we'll move now. We've looked at, I guess, two kind of sets of risks on the value chain: refining and logistics on the one hand, petrol station on the other. And I see there's a tremendous amount of discussion already going in the chat. We'll pick on that just now. Please keep it going. I thought it was also important to look at the other side of the coin, I guess, the opportunity. And what one such opportunity is of course, green fuels, sustainable fuels more widely. To shed some light on that particular topic, very pleased to welcome Farai Chireshe from WWF. Farai is a bioenergy analyst at WWF. He's really an expert on sustainable aviation fuel. He's looked at it from many angles. He's been working on it for a while now, both as a renewable energy expert and a chemical engineer. So really, more broadly as well, WWF has been doing some work on this opportunity for some time, and is going to present some of that work. Unfortunately, not time to present all of the work that they've been doing over the years, but certainly some of the work that has been done recently on the topic. Farai, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gaylor, for the introduction, and good afternoon, colleagues. I hope you can all see my screen.
Perfect.
Wonderful. As Gaylor has mentioned, WWF has been working on this opportunity for quite some time now of how we can produce sustainable aviation fuels from various feedstocks in South Africa. And some of the work that I'm going to share with you today was work that was delivered for us by various partners, including Stellenbosch University, the CSIR, Imperial Logistics, as well as Blue North Consulting. So I'm going to start off by giving you some introduction and context. We've heard and talked to some extent about the coal value chain this afternoon. And what we know is about 4,000 people are currently employed as coal truckers. And as the country moves away from coal in the energy transition, these people are going to be vulnerable. So there's a potential to find alternative options for these coal truckers in new, by transporting biomass or sustainable biomass for that matter, in new green industries. And we believe that a sustainable aviation industry is one such example. I'll keep on referring to SAF going forward, and that would mean sustainable aviation fuels. So what we know about the growing impact of aviation on the climate. Currently, commercial aviation accounts for about 2 to 3% of the global CO2 emissions. And if we don't intervene, this is expected to rise to 22% of all anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And this is where sustainable aviation fuels come in. And according to the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, sustainable aviation fuels will contribute 65% of the emission reductions in 2050. So unlike other industries like road transport, whose emissions can be mitigated by direct electrification, it is a challenge for long-haul aviation, particularly, and therefore we advocate for sustainable aviation fuels, and they're essentially like-for-like fuels with fossil derived jet fuels, and therefore they can be used in existing equipment as well as existing aeroplanes. So why should South Africa pursue sustainable aviation fuels. Firstly, we have an excellent resource base. That means the number of feedstocks that we can use to produce SAF. As Gaylor mentioned earlier, we have extensive experience in the Fischer-Tropsch processes that SASO uses to produce liquid fuels from coal. So there's a potential and an opportunity to tap into that expertise. And we do need to decarbonize our own aviation sector, as I alluded to earlier. And also there's a massive export opportunity that lies for the country by producing these sustainable aviation fuels locally and selling them to markets like Europe or the United States, where there's a structural demand of sustainable fuels as it stands. So I'm just going to go through the approach that we took to assess the SAF production potential in South Africa. We looked at 7 feedstock and technology combinations, as you can see on the screen below. And this brought us 7 different pathways in which one could produce sustainable aviation fuels. So the feedstocks that we considered were Solaris seeds, which is a nicotine-free version of tobacco. It was trialed in Limpopo and Mpumalanga a couple of years ago, and South African Airways actually did demonstration flights using sustainable aviation fuel produced from Solaris seeds. We also looked at sugarcane. The sugarcane industry is looking to diversify, and producing sustainable aviation fuels is one of those opportunities for them. We also looked at industrial waste gases. Industrial waste gases are the gases that are emitted typically in ferroalloy plants and steel mills. They're currently being flared without energy recovery. So there's an opportunity to use them to produce sustainable fuels. And then lastly, we also looked at lignocellulosic waste. And most of this was invasive alien plants, or IAPs. Now, the country does suffer from an invasive alien plant problem. We estimated there are over 200 million dry tons of invasive alien plants all across the country. The current legislation requires invasive alien plants to be removed. The current program, the Working for Water program, for instance, that is involved in some clearing, in alien clearing, but most of the times these invasive alien plants are just left in the field without additional, without any valorization. So producing sustainable aviation fuels from them would be an opportunity to add economic value to them. You'll see that in the way that we modeled our process, we envisaged that in most cases there will be 2 biorefineries. So 1, an intermediate processing facility, and 2, a final processing facility. The reason why we looked at this was because for biomass or bioenergy projects, you want to have your facility located as close to the feedstock source as possible. So essentially your intermediate processing facility will be located close to your biomass source. And then you have a central or final processing facility which would benefit from economies of scale because it's much larger, and would be able to process the intermediate product from different intermediate processes or intermediate facilities across the country. So first we did a network optimization through a center of gravity analysis, where we optimized the location of those facilities close to the biomass source. As I mentioned, this was followed by transport costing to estimate how much money it would cost to move the biomass to an intermediate facility, as well as the intermediate product to a final facility. And using that data, we then come with the SAF production potential and cost per facility, and then aggregated those numbers for all facilities to have a national production or national SAF production potential. So for the first 3 pathways, they use different feedstocks. So it's possible to do all these 3 pathways in parallel, or they can all happen. They're not mutually exclusive. However, if you consider the lignocellulosic pathways, they compete for the same feedstock. So through our analysis, we saw that pathway 6A was the most economical, and that is the pathway that we used to be the indicative lignocellulosic pathway for producing sustainable aviation fuels, and that's the pathway that I'll be referring to going forward. We also looked at two scenarios of producing sustainable aviation fuels. So one was an energy self-sufficiency scenario. So in the energy self-sufficient scenario, this means that the energy required to meet the processing demands, as well as energy required to, or as well as the hydrogen requirements are for the process, come from converting part of the feedstock. We looked at another case of external energy or renewable energy scenario, where renewable or green hydrogen produced by renewable energy would be used in these biorefineries to produce sustainable aviation fuels. In terms of the approach to determine the socio-economic impacts of the domestic SAF sector, we used the iJedi model developed by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the USA. So it's an input and output model. It takes into account facility specifications and costing data, and then outputs jobs in terms of direct, indirect, as well as induced jobs. We then further on to do a detailed transport jobs analysis. This included a route and volume analysis, and this was undertaken by Imperial Logistics, taking into account industry standards, South African industry standards, to estimate the potential trucking jobs from implementing this SAF supply chains. So what you see on the screen now is the SAF production potential, or in South Africa, that we estimated. We estimated that under the self-sufficient scenario, South Africa could produce 3.2 billion liters of SAF. And when one uses green hydrogen, that potential increases to about 4.5 billion liters of sustainable aviation fuels. So these are quite significant volumes, given that currently, or pre-COVID, the national jet fuel consumption is about 2.5 billion liters. So we will have enough SAF to use locally as well as to export. On the right-hand side, you'll see our proposed locations for the final SAF facilities across the country. You'll see that most of them lie in the northeastern parts of the country. That is where most of the biomass is in terms of the invasive alien plants, and that is where you can also grow your Solaris tobacco. And as Dave mentioned earlier, these biorefineries or these facilities could provide employment for the process operators. And as a case in point, you can see that there are some facilities closer to the Durban area, and as well some facilities closer to Natref in the Mpumalanga, Sasolburg area. So our analysis found out that there are domestic SAF sectors, the potential to create over 90,000 green jobs. So these are direct jobs, excluding any indirect jobs that come out of this. And if we were to, from a construction perspective, so construction, we're looking at jobs over a 3-year period. The construction phase could create almost 40,000 direct jobs if we consider that we do as much localization as possible. In our analysis, CSIR looked at which of the different equipment can be sourced and produced locally and which ones cannot. And that is how we determined our level of localization. And in the operational jobs, we see that growing Solaris is quite labor intensive, and this could result in over 19,700 permanent agricultural jobs in this industry. And I also need to highlight here that the clearing of invasive alien plants would also result in much more jobs as well. So In terms of the jobs generated in the construction phase, you see those for maximum localization scenarios I mentioned earlier. You will see that there are jobs for all the pathways 1 to 6B, and obviously in practicality, when you are implementing these pathways, one project developer might decide to choose one pathway or one technology over the other. But in our scenario, we only assumed that only one technology per feedstock could be used or could be realized. So the jobs here represent jobs for all the different pathways, but the numbers that I talked about, the 40,000 jobs in construction, would be a combination of jobs for pathway 1, pathway 2, pathway 3, and pathway 6A, which we determined to be the most economical lignocellulosic-based pathway. On the right-hand side, you see jobs in the operations phase, a significant amount of jobs being in feedstock sourcing. So there's over 25 direct jobs here, mostly in feedstock sourcing for pathway 1, which is the Solaris-based pathway, and for pathways 4 to 6B, the lignocellulosic pathways, most of those jobs are related to sourcing the feedstocks. So for sourcing the invasive alien plants. Quite important to note that pathway 2 is the sugarcane-based pathway. So under pathway 2, so these are not new jobs created, but these are jobs that would be preserved if the sugar industry diverts or to produce sustainable aviation fuels. So these are not new jobs created, but rather new jobs preserved for the sugarcane industry. Digging in a bit deeper into, more specifically into the transport jobs, we did map out the employment opportunities of a domestic SAF across South Africa. And as you can see from the table on the left-hand side, for the different pathways and the different feedstocks, you will see jobs on a national level, as well as jobs in coal mining areas. So what we did is, after estimating the jobs nationally, we then superimposed coal mining regions on coal mining regions on the national SAF-derived trucking jobs. And then we were able to account or come up or estimate the number of driving jobs that would be within those coal mining regions. And we assume that these coal mining or these jobs within these coal mining regions would be an opportunity for drivers currently for coal drivers, because we do know that coal the coal trucks usually operate over a very short period of time from in a short distance from the coal mining, from the coal mines themselves. So you do see that a majority of the jobs are, again, in the northeastern parts of the country, and that is where most of our coal mining activities are. So there's a nice synergy there and an opportunity for coal truckers to transition to biomass, to transition to biomass trucking in the SAF value chain. So you can see the different numbers for national transport as well as coal mining for Solaris tobacco. So interestingly, for the lignocellulosic biomass, nationally, we have about 4,800 jobs. And in the coal mine, it's actually 6,000 jobs nationally and about 2,900 jobs in the coal mining regions. So one of the highlights from our study, we found that almost 75% of the current coal trucking jobs could be directly transitioned to biomass transport. This was based on the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment undertaken by TIPS, which came up, or which estimated that that there are currently 4,000 coal trucker jobs at the moment, and about or almost 3,000 trucker jobs in a biomass value chain are located in those core regions. And these could be, and those core truckers could be used to transport biomass almost directly and almost immediately. So you can imagine a coal trucker that is transporting biomass to, or that's transporting coal to Saso Secunda. They could, in theory, wake up the next day and start transporting biomass to Secunda for it to be processed there, as an example. So it's a really huge opportunity that needs to be tapped into. There are also other different trucker jobs, for instance, Superlink or flatbed driver jobs. But it's important to note there that there's a cost involved in converting a Superlink to a side tipper truck. Similarly, a cost involved if you were to convert a coal trucker to a tanker, for instance. They would come with some capital investments required there, but a side tipper is almost like replacement. Also important to note there is that there are other jobs that are preserved in refueling and maintenance. If these coal truckers continue to work after the transition from coal to biomass, for instance. So just highlighting some of the key messages from our study. A domestic SAF industry is a pillar for South Africa's low carbon economy. And there's a potential for over 90,000 direct jobs with about 20,000 farm workers, with about 20,000 of those jobs being farm workers for a Solaris-based pathway. And the opportunities for coal truckers are quite vast. And nationally, there could be about 7,500 trucker jobs, plus 800 support jobs. So support jobs would be jobs relating to the clerks required to run and organize the logistics. And these jobs the support jobs don't necessarily have to be based in the core regions, but could be based elsewhere. As I mentioned, almost 3/4 or 75% of the coal truckers can be directly transitioned to biomass without reskilling. And over 20% of the current coal truckers could have opportunities driving other truck types, but there could be reskilling required for tanker drivers, as well as some form of investment to change the truck type from a tipper truck, for instance, to a flatbed or to a tanker. Additionally, jobs in refueling and maintenance would be preserved by biomass-based jobs. And another important thing is that SAF can be a hydrogen sink and support the development of South Africa's hydrogen economy. So we did see that if green hydrogen is used to produce SAF, the potential volume increases significantly. And if I could just go back to this diagram showing our potential SAF facilities, you do see that some of those facilities lie within the hydrogen valley region that the DSI has mapped up. So there are potential synergies to grow both the SAF sector as well as the hydrogen sector in South Africa. Yeah, relevant publications, our Fuel for the Future publication, and our work that we did on coal truckers. And then lastly, we did some work before that looked at developing or where could we grow purposefully, or where could we grow crops in a way that doesn't impact food, water availability, as well as biodiversity. And all these publications are available. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Farai. I think that's really exciting work. Yeah, I think I'm really excited about the potential of this, and then also I think the overlap with coal truckers is something that I find very powerful. Of course, we know that the sustainable aviation fuel industry does not yet exist per se, and we have a lot of work to do ahead of us if we have to tap into this opportunity and get it realized. But certainly, it seems like the market going forward will exist. There will be a sizable amount of demand for this, and we have a lot of assets on our end. So it could be one of the key opportunities. I see there's still quite a lot of discussion in the chat. That's really great. It's going on, and I was going to pick up on some of those questions, but I think they've been answered very well in the chat by the presenters. So please keep that going. I saw some really great discussion on issues of security of supply. Should we be worried? Probably not. What about the site cleanup? Whose responsibility is it to clean up sites, refineries, but also petrol stations? I think some pretty detailed answers were provided in the chat as well. Some discussion on wage dynamics as well as the age of workers at petrol stations. We have some data, not all the data, but it provides some area for thinking. Of course, again, the discussion around, well, how soon could we look at a decline in the petrol consumption? And that's really all depends on the car park and what we think going forward. So lots of assumptions going into that. If we go for aggressive transition, it's going to be quicker. But there's still, even if tomorrow we stop selling internal combustion vehicle cars, which is not really on the cards for now, we would still have petrol and diesel cars in the car park for at least a decade or two. And of course, on SAF, what would it take to get that going is a big question. Cost implications, the policy implications, and so forth. So I think let's keep that discussion going in the chat as well, and then throughout the panel discussion. Talking about our panel, let's move right in. We've got three great panelists to take those issues a little further, and I'll give them about 5-6 minutes each to make introductory inputs, to highlight kind of what do they think about these issues. Where do they sit when it comes to the risks, when it comes to the opportunities. When it comes to what do we need to do in this value chain, I think is really fundamental. So first up, very pleased to welcome Shamini Arrington. Shamini's got multiple hats. She's Vice President at SASOL for climate change, where she's been working for quite some time in the field of sustainability and climate change. She's also a commissioner on the newly, it's not so new anymore, I guess, but a year or so now, new Presidential Climate Commission appointed in the end of 2020. And she's also the chair of the BUSA Environment and Just Transition committees, and sitting at NEDLAC from a business perspective. So multiple hats from Shamini, where multiple angles on the issue clearly. So I'm sure lots to say on the topic. So Shamini, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Gaylor. Thanks to everyone on the chat for all the discussions and all of the other panelists and presenters. Good to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. So I was asked to reflect with my various hats. I'm not going to take any one of them. I think given where we are at, it's important to speak broadly. I'm going to bring in a little bit of the SASOL view, as well as the broad business view, and as well as some of the PCC view. So with that said, I think let's dive right in. So I was asked to reflect what does this mean, and some of the studies and what it means to us and how we think about this. So from a business perspective broadly, we agree. We're very supportive of what's been said. I think the risks are very clear. What we are seeing is that there is definitely a decline. We're seeing it already. I mean, as was mentioned by Dave, refineries are closing. We ourselves as business did the NBI Climate Pathways work, which we've studied I think it's about a year ago now we started this. And so we also saw that this was coming. You know, a lot of these things were being mentioned and spoken about. We've also done as SASL quite a lot of scenario analysis ourselves that shows, you know, that liquid fuels demand is coming down. Electric vehicles are going up. That's slightly delayed in South Africa. And what I see reflected by all of the speakers, Gaylor, is very much the same sentiments. And we're seeing this playing out in real time now, today. And I think that's really the importance of what was said for me, is the urgency to act and to act now. I really am supportive of everything that Farai has said. I mean, this is really our strategy as well as SASL in terms of where we see the opportunity. But what's also indicated was that it's one opportunity. We need to think about a suite of opportunities here, because one opportunity is not going to address the gravity and the scale of the challenge we are facing. I mean, just the petrol stations you mentioned, plus coupling that with coal mining, I mean, those numbers are staggering. We're talking about job loss that sitting in millions. And if not timed appropriately, we're going to sit with a huge challenge where you're going to have job loss happening at such a pace and you don't have sectors in which to redeploy. And that's really the important thing that we as SASL put in the heart of everything that we've announced. So just to take a step back, you know, last year, SASL announced our Future SASL strategy. And really what that was based on was a fossil fuel free vision, where we see SAF being, you know, a critical product slate from the company. But really to do that, we see green hydrogen at the heart of everything we're doing. We see biomass playing a very big role also in the transition, you know, unavoidable carbon, as we call it, or industrial streams. You know, how can we utilize carbon from other processes in this as we move to getting the scale that's going to come or needed for biomass? We're not there yet. Farai indicated that already, we need to grow there. But at the same time, the markets for SAF is growing. And what we sit back with is a huge opportunity to act, but we need to act quickly in terms of setting that pace. Whilst we do that, we need to decarbonize. So SASL is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. I mean, just within the petrochem sector, we're emitting, or we represent, I should say, 85% of the sector's emissions. That's large. So there's a very big urgency for us to decarbonize. But what we did was, we've got this long-term vision. We've got a net zero target by 2050. We've got a 2030 target, 30% reduction. But we said, you know, we can see already job loss happening in all of the different sectors. Can we really now start pulling back on coal so quickly and so fast that it shocks the system? I mean, Dave said it. Our job creation opportunity and jobs we have currently overshadows what he put forward. That's so true. Direct jobs are alone about 28,000 with coal mining jobs. Just put it in perspective. Can you imagine indirect and induced jobs? Secunda, the whole area, Sasolburg, etc. Not going to go there, but I mean, these are the things that we need to think about. So what we did was we sat back and we put a plan in place that said, okay, given that 2035 and post that, where, you know, ICE vehicles are coming off the market in South Africa, where we see liquid fuels demand dropping off, we need to now start planning today. So we'll decarbonize using existing technologies. We will look at transition gas, because if you look at how that plays out against coal, it's quite a big shift and a big drop in our emissions. We will look at growing renewables. So we've got a big target around 1,200 megawatts. I must add a very big localization component to that as well. So we're looking at how we can grow manufacturing hubs to create jobs, etc. But then we also said, whilst we're decarbonizing, meeting our 30%, we're going to start growing and advancing the green hydrogen economy. Why? It comes back to what I raised earlier. We need to time this. We need to bring in the low carbon sectors and try to bring it in place at scale, at the level to be able to actually bring jobs in at the same time that we pull back on fossil fuels. And so that's what we did. So now we are sitting with a number of projects that we want to get off the ground. So we're looking for partners, and we're here to share with you what we are doing. We can't do it on our own. It needs the likes of WWF, TIPS, and all of you great people who are thinking in this direction to work together with us, other business, to be able to see this to fruition and the reality and size that we need to create the jobs we need in this country. So what are we doing? We've got 3 big projects, and then I'll leave it at that and open up for some discussion. So to just give you, I'm not going to carry on, Gaylor. We've got 3 big projects we're looking at. The first one is obviously Sasolburg. We're looking to produce green hydrogen by as early as 2023. That's next year, guys. That's how soon we're talking about it. I just want to put that out there. That puts a real signal and a peg in the ground to say, you know what, we can do this. But of course, there's a number of things that have to, work, and the puzzle pieces need to come together. One of which is policy. We really need that. And we need South Africa to be recognized in an international playing field. That's another one. So the second project that we are looking at is SAF from Secunda. And here we want to really demonstrate that we can do this in Secunda. We've got a small project that we're working on. We call it the High Shift Project. It's with partners like Linda, Enertrac, Navitas. But really, Farai, I mean, you know this well as well, we're looking for biomass for that project. So we can already co-feed up to 2%. We're looking for about 300 to 400 kilotons of biomass with biomass preference because of how Secunda is set up and the efficiencies that you get with that. But we're already trying to test this, have proof of concept, see how it can be done. And together with that, the logistics, the whole transport supply chain, all of that. How can we do this together? And then, of course, that's brownfield projects. So we're looking to start converting our own facilities. But then we've got a greenfield project because you can't just look at brownfield. You've got to look at greenfield. And here we're talking about the Bukubai project. It's in partnership with the Gauteng Provincial Department, with the presidency. We've got various other players. The IDC is also heavily involved. So we're looking to actually get a greenfield project off the ground, the Bukubai project in Northern Cape. And really what's critically important about this, just in the first phase, we create up to 6,000 permanent jobs, 15,000 indirect or construction jobs, I should say, and this can be scaled up. We're talking about just in the first phase. Can you imagine if we get up to scale on this, what it means for the country, what it means for a hydrogen valley ecosystem that's set up with Northern Cape? It actually means we can also start utilizing that green hydrogen that's produced there, which is primarily targeting the export market because of affordability. But into the future that changes, we can then use it to decarbonize iron and steel, cement, and all of these hard to abate sectors really then become something that's within reach to decarbonize. So I'm going to leave it there. There's so much more I can say. You can see I'm very passionate about this, so very eager to hear from the crowd as well. So thank you, Gaylor.
Great, fantastic, Shamini. Yeah, you said a lot in a very short space. So I think that's really great. And I mean, to hear what Sasol is, by the way, is the size of the opportunity is massive. I mean, when it comes to green hydrogen, and you talk to the Europeans, they pretty much tell you, look, just build it, we'll buy it. It just doesn't matter. They need so much of it. Was in a workshop not recently, and they said, if they covered the entirety of Europe to produce green hydrogen, they will only meet 20% of the needs. And that's just covering the whole Europe. So I think there is a massive market out there, and we ought to tap into that. I think that's a no-brainer. So yeah, I think let's do unpack. I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion on this. Feel free to raise your hand as well, and or make comments in the chat. We'll pick on that in a moment. I just now want to welcome our next panelist, Boitumelo Molefe. She is a Social Development Policy Coordinator at COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And she's also sits at NEDLAC in the Development Chamber, and has been really working on, of course, on anything to do with social policy and social development for quite some time, both at COSATU and prior to that at NALEDI. So brings a slightly different perspective. I'm sure some of the discussions around petrol station will resonate, but also, of course, refineries. But and the other side of that is the job creation and the job potential. So, Boitumelo, over to you.
Sure, thank you, Gaylor. Thank you to TIPS and the WWF for inviting us to this webinar. Mine would be from the perspective of the COSATU Just Transition Blueprint. Just to give a bit of background, is that this blueprint was developed in 2021 with the assistance of the IEJ. A research was commissioned with the IEJ to try to assist us as workers to create an end state to envision what a just transition is and what it looks like for us. We focused on 3 different sectors, which was agriculture, coal mining, as well as transport. So basically, we took from what was the 15 principles that were highlighted in the COSATU policy, a just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. We built from that and kind of established pathways to which we envisage a just transition. We have quite a number of demands in the blueprint. We have 24 demands, but in the most important and prioritized, we felt that job employment creation, like you just mentioned, Gaylor, and sustainable industrial policy would be important. Social protection is very important for us, where we speak about a universal basic income grant. Reskilling and skilling is important for us as labor. We speak to how it is important that there be land redistribution and an end to austerity. So basically, we have these demands where we speak of what a just transition across the sectors would be like, but especially how it is important that workers are kept in the loop and workers are part of the social dialogue. We sit at NetLike, and that's where most of social dialogue takes place. And we have been quite vocal in speaking about issues of the just transition and how it affects workers, and how we feel that there should be collaboration between stakeholders to ensure that workers are able to be brought into this just transition, and it's not just be a top-down approach. We believe in a bottom-up approach where workers are given the opportunity and the space to speak about what a just transition is for them. One of the demands in the blueprint speaks very well and is aligned to the TIPS paper on sector jobs resilience plan on the petroleum-based transport value chain. When we speak about SRJPs in our blueprint, we speak about the importance of having a just transition commission. The Presidential Climate Change Commission is quite important, and in fact, TIPS views the PCC as one of the most important bodies in which we can have this discussion of a just transition. So we believe in that this should be something that is expedited and is a way in which we can take the discussion of a just transition forward. We believe that there should be sector-specific job plans that are developed in order to address the issues of a just transition. This is to ensure and protect livelihoods. The promotion of technologies that can be created in the value chain is very important. So we speak about how important the manufacturing of electric vehicles is. This is in fact speaking highly of the manufacturing sector as one of the sectors in which people work is in the transport system in its entirety, because we look at the transport system in its entirety as opposed to at this point going to the subsectors like the subject of this webinar is. So workers basically in the transport sector believe that there should be emphasis put on expanding and integrating public transport, the alignment of transport policies. So basically a just transition in the transport sector as envisioned by us as workers is a just transition that speaks to the reduced transport use by improving urban planning. We speak about shift to low carbon modes of transport and how this is important, as well as the improving of electrification of vehicles and the infrastructure of vehicles. Workers are quite clear in what they seek to see as a just transition in the transport sector. Therefore, when we speak about the pathways of this just transition and how we see the absorption of labor in the just transition in the transport sector, we viewed the housing, construction and infrastructure as one of the most important parts where we can see labor go into. Bus and transport drivers for expanded public transport can be prioritized to ensure that there's an integrated public transport system, local manufacturing and production of electric vehicles, the upgrading of the rail network, creating construction, operating and maintenance jobs, as well as manufacturing of railway infrastructure and locomotives. So basically how we see that the transport sector transforming is having workers be able to be be given skills and are reskilled into jobs in this new sector that will emerge after post this transition. We speak about how important dialogue is, and basically the importance of having research, having innovation that would inform the decisions that would come and give workers the opportunity to create and be part of jobs that are meaningful, jobs that are decent, and jobs that are sustainable. So that would be from COSATU's perspective. We work alongside our affiliates, who are in the transport sector, SADAO. So basically what we do at this point and what we're doing as Labour is try to encourage the dialogue and try to see how the ambition of a just transition would be in the transport sector. Thank you, Gaylor.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mel, for highlighting some of the work that the Federation has been doing. Just by the way, as well, for everyone, I mean, the blueprint is available. I'm sure if you can maybe pop the link into the chat for everyone to have a look, and making sure that we keep the conversation going on those particular issues on each value chain and each sector. So I think it's a good reference as well to start the conversation. Oh, I see it. It's there in the chat. Thank you. I want to take our next input to take the conversation a bit forward, and then we'll open as well to the floor. If you've got questions or comments you want to make, just raise your hand, and we'll take them after Rod. I'm sure Rod is no stranger to most people in the room, but Rod Crampton is a visiting professor at the Wits Business School. He established the African Energy Leadership Center, and is still a visiting professor there. He was a full-time board member of our energy regulator for over a decade, and prior to that, worked in various ministries. He's also a non-executive director of our utility, ESCOM, so well-versed from multiple aspects as well of that transition. And a key player played a role in shaping some of the developments, certainly in the liquid fuel value chain in the country from a regulatory perspective and other aspects as well. So very keen to hear your thoughts on the topic, Rod. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Gaylor, for that kind introduction. This is a tough act to follow after all of these speakers have made so many important points, but I'll try and focus on some of the points that they haven't covered. So first of all, let's just get a bit of perspective here. There's in this discussion about the just energy transition, there's a lot of fuss about electricity and jobs, but money is also important. So if we look at the value of sales of petroleum products in South Africa, the value is 60% larger than the value of electricity. Just think about that, 60% larger. The jobs in the liquid fuels value chain is much less than electricity, but from economic impact point of view, that's a significant number, and it also presents a massive opportunity, particularly in regard to electric vehicles, which I'll come back to in a moment. The second point no one has really talked about is the demand side. We've got new transport patterns evolving all the time. There's Uber, rideshare, Uber Eats, all kinds of technologies are popping up all the time, which are changing the demand pattern for fuels, and very little work has been done about that. So that's a big issue to think about. The other point that comes out of the first two presentations is that basically we don't know what we're talking about in terms of numbers of jobs. The data is abysmal. And with all due respect to the numbers people put up, I'm highly suspicious all. I think they're highly suspect numbers, particularly Nokwanda, your numbers on service station employees, I think, are grossly exaggerated. And we did some research for National Treasury 2 years ago, and it's been published. And the fact of the matter is, South Africa doesn't even know how many service stations it has, even though it's a heavily subsidized retail sector. Heavily subsidized. We don't know how many we subsidize. We don't know what we're getting for our money. It seems outrageous, but it's the truth. Nobody knows. Even the oil companies don't know. If you look at their websites, they have different numbers. The same company has different numbers on different places in the same website, even. That's what we found. So this is, to get proper data on the sector, I would submit, is one of the things we should really try and target on, so that we know what we're talking about, because we don't really know the dimensions of what we are talking about. The other big thing to think about in this just transition is the flip side of manufacturing liquid fuels, if you like, in a simple analogy, is petrochemicals and plastics. And in South Africa, we are dependent entirely on Sasol for those raw materials. So what happens at Sasol with regard to liquid fuels has an impact on petrochemicals and plastics, which are a big, big part of our lifestyles at the moment. Huge, huge part of our lifestyles. Just look around you, wherever you are, you'll see plastics in numerous applications. And what are we going to do about those if we are going to curtail the production of liquid fuels, as we need to do to meet climate change objectives? So there's no real thought being given to that really important aspect of what we do there. So let me then talk a little bit about biomass. And Farai, I thought your paper was really very, very interesting. But again, I just want to focus on the things you didn't talk about, which are really important. One is price. Price of these fuels is really important because the energy intensity in biomass is very, very low. In short, you've got to collect a hell of a lot of it from very dispersed geographical locations and bring them to a central processing point to extract very little energy. So price is important, but more important, I would submit, is what we call energy return on energy invested, which simply put, in many biofuels, you use more energy to manufacture the biofuel than you get out of the biofuel, which in my humble opinion is just plain stupid. For a planet that's in such a crisis, to do silly things like that is really just stupid. So you really need to do that calculation, and I urge and encourage you to extend your research into looking at price and energy return on energy invested in biofuels. It's really, really important. And you know, all of the studies we did from 2002 on biofuels onwards all showed the key problem is the transport cost from where the plant is growing to the processing center, and from the processing center to the market. Those transport costs kill biofuels in most respects. Then let's talk a little about electric vehicles and the change. So the point that people haven't mentioned is that, you know, what drives liquid fuels policy in South Africa is really the automobile industry. Not the liquid fuels industry, it's the demand side, it's the motor cars we drive and the engines they have and what they can tolerate, which dictate liquid fuels policy. So if you ask yourself, where do the motor cars manufactured in South Africa get sold? They get sold in Europe. The ones that get sold in South Africa is just a sideshow. It's really a small share of their production. So what happens in Europe is going to dictate to the auto manufacturers in South Africa as to what kind of cars they make. And in Europe, the big policy target is on the back of internal combustion engines. They are in the sights of the policymakers in Europe, and they are getting rid of internal combustion engines as fast as they can. You know, one of the countries I read today, 83% of new vehicles are electric vehicles in that European country already. So what the auto manufacturers decide, and it depends a bit on what South African government decides, is going to affect us greatly. You know, if South Africa doesn't remove the discrimination against electric vehicles in the trade regime that exists today, if it doesn't create a level playing field for electric vehicles, I suspect that these auto companies, which are huge and important employers in manufacturing, will simply go to some other country that has more sensible policies, because there would be no reason to stay here if you can't sell at least a portion of your market here. Because if Dave Wright is correct, that the demand for electric vehicles is postponed to 2035, and many of us would challenge him on that, but if he's right, then their sensible action is simply to close their factories here and go and build them in countries which are more sensible about electric vehicles. So this thing might be coming a lot faster than we expect. And of course, if the South African government woke up and leveled the playing field, we would have far more production of electric vehicles in this country at lower prices, which would increase demand, move to economy of scale, and would help us. But that's the big issue we have to look at. And how quickly we move to electric vehicles determines how quickly we reduce the demand for fuels. So in a way, we are fortunate. I mean, it's a sort of ironic fortunate that the refineries have mostly closed already. So those jobs are already gone and they're not coming back. There's no prospect of them coming back, in my view. So we've suffered the main pain in the refining sector. It's in the retailing sector where we have to think about liquid fuels as an issue, because that's where most of the jobs are. And that's the only place in South Africa where jobs are protected by law. Some of you may not know this. Fuel station attendants are the only jobs in South Africa which you may not do. Only a fuel attendant can do it by law. They are protected by law. However, those jobs are evaporating already as engines get more efficient and as electric vehicles come in and other things like that. So that's the area we have to look at. But fortunately, there are lots of other opportunities. If we think of a switch to electric vehicles, there's huge amount of investment to be made in the infrastructure, the filling stations, in inverted commas, for electric vehicles, whether they're at home or at work, or indeed, if you believe some oil companies, they'll stay at some of the existing service stations. I don't believe that. I think some of them will stay there. But I mean, why would you want to go and sit at a service station and drink coffee for 20 minutes while your car charges when you could do it at home or at work? I mean, Standard Bank in Johannesburg is already charging their staff's car at work while they do it. But that's a lot of jobs, installing all that infrastructure and maintaining it. That's a lot of jobs that petrol pump attendants could be retrained to do. So the job markets, just to end off with very quickly, that are threatened by electric vehicles are auto assembly, repairs, auto parts. I'm talking about secondary market replacement parts will be affected because the global markets for those are dropping, and those mostly get exported to the first world. But if we can shift our market to more developing countries, which will stay with liquid fuels longer, they could maybe survive longer. And of course, the filling stations I've mentioned. And I've talked already about the potential for jobs, not only in the charging stations for electric vehicles, but in the power stations. You know, power stations now range from matchbox size to industrial scale. I've got a matchbox size power station, which charges little things for me. So you can have it any size you like. And there's a lot to be installed on people's business places, roofs, and home roofs and things like that. There's a huge amount of construction jobs that are going to be there for 20 years. So we have to really think about those opportunities. The last point, perhaps, is the broader impact on the macroeconomy of these macro shifts and how important energy is in the internal engine of the economy is really important, and nobody is really looking at that properly. We've started a bit of work at WITS, but we really are only at the beginning. So any others who are looking at that, that's really important because it has really big impacts. And because as I said at the beginning, money is also important. Thanks, Gaylor.
Thank you so much, Rod, I think, for very passionate input. And I think you did a great job at poking holes in everyone's presentation. So I don't need to do that. That's good. But I think in taking the discussion forward, I think it's really important. We all agree these are very complex issues. Data is not what we would like it to be, and the moment you start modeling the future, you're probably wrong. So it's always very difficult to get it right, or at least to get it as close as possible to what's really going to happen. If you look at even international publications, IEA or whatever, and every year they change it, and every year it's like, if you do a graph, which I've done once, of the modeling for electric vehicles, and you take all their publications year after year, every year it changes quite significantly. It's only 20, a few months away, and they're changing their thinking quite a lot. So, so I think that's not surprising. I want to give the opportunity to our panelists and presenters to maybe come in and react to some of the key points that have been made by others. There's a lot in the chat that was raised. I see most of it was, I guess, partly answered directly. Thank you to the panelists and the presenters for keeping the discussion live on the chat. But maybe just to see if you want to come back and address some of the points that we raised by other presenters and panelists, or maybe questions of clarity. Some I see you might not have had a chance to address in the chat. I'll just ask you to maybe keep your input brief. I mean, we've got about 10 to 12 minutes left, so keep your responses fairly brief. That'd be great. I'm looking at if someone wants to start. I see Sharmini is fine, so I'll give her the floor first.
I thought you were opening up to the audience. Well,
I will open up to her, but no one wants to raise their hands, so I'll take that.
So I'll give it a go. Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with almost all of the points that Rod has raised. I mean, it's excellent points, and he's pointed to exactly what I was saying. This is not a slam dunk. There's so much more that needs to be done. I think the big glaring one that all of us knows, green financing and more financing. I mean, financing is now financing, right? All green is, well, vanilla financing is basically green. So that's what we're seeing now. But I mean, we're talking mega scale projects, mega transformations. 8.5 billion is really just the tip of the iceberg. We really need to get real about what this is going to mean. I also touched on the fact that policy is needed. We need an enabling policy environment. We need a clear vision. And, the PCC has come out, and they've come out strong with what the targets are, and they've come out with the just transition framework. But we really need an aligned view about where we are going, what's the end point, are we targeting net zero, and if so, what are the milestones we need to do to get ourselves there, and what are the opportunities to deal with the just transition? I mean, we need to be clear about that. We need to be very precise and intentional to actually do these things. So the policy landscape, critically important. I think, an enabling policy environment needs more than just negative incentives, for example, or negative policies. We need positive incentives. Rod spoke about, subsidies in a different way. We've had fossil fuel subsidies. How do we look at incentivizing growth in the low carbon sector? How do we look at a green fund, rebates of a different kind? How do we pay back this capital so you can incentivize more private capital? I mean, how do we do this? These are big questions, and I don't think we've really gotten to the nub of the issue or really had that tough conversation. We need to talk about it. And I raised some of the gas issues. I mean, green hydrogen is in the future. What are we going to do now, and how are we going to start the transition, and how are we going to start thinking about jobs in relation to the alternatives we are looking at? So all critical questions. I don't have the answer at all of them, but let me open up to the rest of the speakers. Thank you, Gaylor.
Yeah, thank you, Shamini. And I think, you on the policy changes, I mean, the policy shifts for me, it's so fundamental. When you're talking about green hydrogen, the numbers get mind-boggling. To tap into the opportunity, you're talking 200, maybe 300 gigawatts of renewable energy. I mean, that's just, it's 5-6 times the size of our current grid. I saw some number the other day to turn just Secunda to green hydrogen, 25 gigawatts. this is half our grid, I mean, for one facility, okay, a big one, but just one facility. So those numbers are quite quite mind-boggling, and I think how we get that right is the tough question that we have to sort out. So I think we've got a lot of work to do on that particular front. I'm gonna give the floor to Nokwanda now before I go back to some of the others. There were some data issues, of course, raised on this, which we all know are difficult. But also a great discussion I saw on the kind of the characteristics and the features of the workers. So maybe if you want to comment on that, Nokwanda, as well as anything else that you think would be relevant.
Sure, thanks, Gaylor. Yeah, no, so I mean, I agree with Rod on the issue of data. I think there's definitely issues there, and part of the problem, I think, is how some of the surveys are done. And it's even worse with the 2020 data, because obviously there's COVID impacts there, so some of the surveys are not at all up to scratch. But I am curious in terms of what you think the numbers are, and whether when you say the numbers are over exaggerated, do you include other workers at petrol stations, or are you only looking at petrol attendants? Because what I'm looking at also includes the people who work in the forecourts, as well as all other workers in there. So some of these petrol stations have car washes, for example. I believe based on the data, those workers would also be included, which is why that number is slightly higher. But I am curious in terms of where you think the numbers would be. And I did see a suggestion of which organization has better numbers. Thank you for that. I just can't remember who shared that in the group. Gaylor, I am not sure, I didn't hear clearly what you wanted me to address, but quickly on the issue of electric vehicles, I think, I mean, again, Rod raised an important issue there, but I think one thing that we should not lose sight of is that these manufacturers, auto manufacturers, also hold quite a lot of power. And if they would like to come to the table about local manufacturing, I mean, they should be able to come to the table. This is not just about what we export out of the country, but what we import, because if those countries are then going to start manufacturing only electric vehicles, we would obviously want to see that happening locally, but those decisions are up to them. And as you were saying, electric cars have relatively fewer parts. And so what would be viable to manufacture locally, considering the fact that a bulk of our manufacturing sector is really just assembly as well as components. Gaylor?
Well, thanks, Nokwanda. Yeah, you could comment on anything you thought was relevant. So that's, I think that's good. Yeah, I think, we just to keep the conversation going. So I'm going to take Rod, he's got his hand up, and I'll give then the floor to Farai as well, to come in on some of the questions that were directed to him. But Rod, over to you.
Thanks very much, Gaylor. I want to, first of all, give a different view to Shimani's about what we call enabling policy. As soon as I hear those words, my radar antenna pick up, and it translates in my head to equals subsidy. When business start talking about enabling policy, they really mean subsidies. And even if they don't, the context we find ourselves in is we have a weak state. Not all government departments are equally weak, but many of them are weak. There are a few surviving which still have some strength. But by and large, they are very weak at policy and very weak at implementation of anything, as somebody else mentioned. So take that as point one. Point two, this tsunami we are in the middle of, or in the process is unfolding around us, of the energy transition, the technologies that are changing so fast, the climate change that's happening so fast. Who do you think can develop policy to deal with that? I mean, really, even the best Einsteins in the world are going to struggle to come up with policy that will take us into the future. What I would submit we really need is for government to get out of the way, to let all of these contesting technologies and energy carriers and so on compete with each other on a level playing field, and we'll see then how it emerges. But if you leave it to government to give enabling policy, they will pick winners. And in this environment, the ability plus the difficulty even of the best people to pick winners, I would submit, is highly suspect. So I think the best policy we should have, the enabling policy, is level playing field for all energy carriers, and government get out the way, please, and stay out the way and let things unfold so that we can have energy competing. I'm not talking now about social policy. If you want social policies as a country, they cost, and we should have them. I have no problem with that. Using taxpayers' money to subsidize people who are poorly off and so on is an excellent idea. But I'm talking about energy policy when I say a level playing field. I'm not talking about social policy, just so we're clear about that. Gaylor, you were talking a bit about hydrogen. You know, very enthusiastically and so on. Calculation my colleague at the African Energy Leadership did recently, Bruce Young, is that hydrogen currently is $800 a barrel oil equivalent. Now think about that. If you're going to put into the world production system energy carriers at 8 times the current cost, what are you doing to the economies? How sustainable is that going to be financially? Environmentally, I don't question that. I think it's an excellent idea environmentally, but think of the economic impact for people when those energy carriers, you know, is 8 times. So yeah, the other question, Nokwanda, about the numbers, perhaps we should take it up offline. I did in the chat refer to the research we did. Those papers are there on the UNU wider website, and you can read there where we did those calculations. But probably this is not the forum to take up a lot of time about these estimates. We tried to reverse engineer the estimates, and we proved that you get extremely different answers. Thanks, Gaylor.
Now, thanks again, Rod, for those points. I think, you know, again, a lot of food for thoughts, and yeah, a lot of things for us to consider. I see we're nearing the end of our time. I do want to give Farai an opportunity to answer some of the questions that were directed to him. So Farai, yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Gaylor, and thank you, Rod, for some of your comments. And also just to say, we did look at the economics and how much it would cost. So it's part of the bigger study, which I did not focus on today. And I do agree, you know, with what you have raised around the transport cost, and that's one issue that we looked at. So we try to address that through our center of gravity analysis, and also trying to locate the facilities as close to the biomass as possible. But admittedly, still, you know, those transport costs would be between 5 to 10%, so somewhat significant. Related to that, I just want to also answer some of Dave's questions around the biomass issues. The feedstocks that we looked at, we tried to look at feedstocks that were sustainable, available, and also accessible. So starting with the Solaris feedstock that we looked at before. So in our previous study, we tried to see what crops can you grow where in South Africa, and we considered different climate scenarios. And for Solaris, it was actually interesting because we noticed that as it got hotter and as the CO2 increased in the atmosphere, due to climate change, the yield of Solaris would actually increase over time. So you'd see that there'll be more of that feedstock, and it has been trialed to grow in South African conditions. Then I also highlight the invasive alien plants biomass. I think that is a national issue. The country is struggling with it. The Department of DFFE, Forestry and Fisheries, is doing some work to try and eradicate it, but not much progress has been done there. So again, it's another implementation issue where now, more work needs to go into that and tying it with a value chain that brings some kind of value addition to that approach. And with invasive alien plants, you do find some of them high up in the mountains where it's not accessible. In our estimation, we looked at a slope of 35%, which we know is kind of the accessible slope for invasive alien plant biomass. So if you were to somehow find access to biomass at higher slopes, then it could be more than what we estimated. We modeled that would move biomass using trucks. And as highlighted before, there are a number of trucks already in South Africa that can move around and carry this biomass. Another thing that I also like to answer, Mike asked around the cost comparison between sustainable aviation fuels and fossil jet fuel. So we do know that SAF currently costs about 3 to 4 times the fossil jet fuel price, but that's not the comparison we should look at or we should focus on. We know that there's a structural shortage of sustainable aviation fuels on the international, on the global market. People are actually looking for places where to buy this SAF. And our analysis has shown that the SAF that we would produce in South Africa is cost competitive with what's currently being sold there. So there's a ready market for it. And as Shamini indicated, if Sasol were to start producing this in their brownfield facilities, that production costs in South Africa will definitely go down. So it's an opportunity that we really need to focus and focus on as a country. Thanks, Gaylor.
Thanks, Farai, for those points. And thank you, everyone, for holding off for a couple more minutes above our time. I just want to give, I guess, last words to Boitumelo as well before we close off. Boitumelo?
Sure, thanks, Gaylor. This was quite helpful and actually a learning for all of us. We have our Labour comrades that have joined the call, and I believe we'll make the necessary steps to try to get all of the voices that were in this room an opportunity to come and educate us as organized labor. We always are open to getting into new ideas, getting into new and more developed ideas that will enrich our discussions of the just transition. So that collaborated, consolidated approach is going to be very important for labor. And yeah, so we look forward to actually having these engagements with various people. I think I particularly enjoyed how Rod came into the discussion and brought across his points. So we will be definitely trying to reach out and enrich our discussions as organized labor and as COSATU, as a federation. So thank you very much for the invitation, and we look forward to further engagement with TIPS and the other organizations that are here.
Thanks so much for that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, as it's generally the case. But really, it was really fantastic. I really want to thank our presenters, our panelists, on behalf of TIPS and WWF for this event. Be on the lookout as well for the recording as well as the research papers linked to this. This is certainly not the end of the discussion, very much the beginning. So also watch out for our next discussion on this, and really keep the discussion going as well. Hopefully you've got a chance to chat to each other as well on the chat, in group and directly. So I think we have a lot of work on our plate, as it's been really clear from everyone's presentation. Some risks, lots of opportunities. So let's get cracking and seize those. Thanks so much, everyone. Keep well. Until next time.